The stagecoach pulled away before Evelyn had both feet on the ground. She heard the driver snap the reins, heard the wheels crunch back into the frozen ruts of the road, and she didn't turn to watch it go. She'd learned somewhere in the last 600 miles that watching things leave only made the leaving worse. So she stood still, carpetbag gripped in both hands, and looked at what was in front of her instead. Black Hollow, Wyoming territory. Population according to the hand-lettered sign nailed to a fence post at the edge of town. 312 souls, God-fearing and otherwise. The town was exactly what it sounded like. A single main street carved out of frozen ground. Maybe 15 buildings on each side, most of them gray with weather. A general store. A saloon with a broken shutter banging against its own frame in the wind. A livery stable that smelled of old hay and older manure even from 20 yards out. A land office with a cracked front window patched with brown paper. And at the far end of the street, almost swallowed by the iron-colored sky, a small church with no steeple, because the steeple had blown off in a storm 2 winters back and nobody had gotten around to replacing it. Evelyn stood at the near end of all of this and breathed slowly. The cold was serious. Not the cold she'd known in Missouri, which was damp and gray and unpleasant, but a different animal entirely. A dry, blade-sharp cold that found the space between your collar and your jaw and simply settled there, patient as stone. Her breath came out in short white bursts. Her fingers, even inside her gloves, were already complaining. She had $41 in the lining of her coat. She had a letter in her carpetbag that she had read so many times she could have recited it from memory, though she'd stopped doing that somewhere around Kansas because it only made her angrier, and anger burned through a person's reserves faster than the cold did. The letter was from a man named Thomas Aldridge Payne, who had written to her in the measured, careful handwriting of someone who had rehearsed his cowardice. Evelyn, by the time this reaches you, I expect the situation will have changed considerably. My father's expectations regarding the matter of my marriage have proven non-negotiable, and I find myself unable to pursue the arrangement we discussed. I hope you understand this is not a reflection of my regard for you, but rather a matter of family obligation that supersedes personal preference. I have enclosed the address of a cousin in Wyoming who may be able to provide temporary accommodation while you determine your next course of action. I wish you well. No signature. Not even that much. The cousin, it turned out, had sold his property in Black Hollow 8 months ago and moved to Colorado. Nobody in town seemed to know exactly where. The land office man had looked at Evelyn with a particular expression she was getting used to, somewhere between pity and suspicion with a thin coating of judgment on top, and said he couldn't help her. So here she was, standing at the edge of a street she didn't know, in a town that hadn't asked for her, with $41 and a carpetbag and the kind of cold that made you wonder, briefly and darkly, what the point of continuing was. She thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. Then she picked up her bag and started walking toward the general store, because that was the most practical thing she could think of, and Evelyn Mercer, whatever else she was, had always been practical. The general store was run by a woman named Dottie Marsh, which Evelyn noted with some relief. Dottie was in her 50s, solid as a fence post, with gray-streaked hair pinned back hard against her skull, and the look of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything the world threw at her. She glanced up when Evelyn came in, took in the carpetbag and the road-worn coat and the particular set of Evelyn's jaw, and said nothing for a moment. "Cold out," Dottie finally offered. "Very," Evelyn agreed. "You come in on the stage?" "Yes." "Passing through or staying?" It was a question Evelyn hadn't quite answered for herself yet. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. Dottie studied her a moment longer, then turned back to the bolt of cloth she'd been measuring. "There's a boarding house on Callaway Street. That's the little cut-through between here and the livery. Mrs. Fenwick runs it. She's particular, but she's fair. Tell her Dottie sent you." "Thank you. Rooms are $1.50 a week." Dottie paused. "She'll ask where you came from and why you're here. She asks everybody that. You can tell her what you like." There was something in the way she said it, a slight emphasis on what you like, that Evelyn appreciated, a small kindness, an acknowledgement that a woman's past was her own business. She felt something in her chest loosen slightly, just the smallest bit, like a knot releasing one thread. "I appreciate it," Evelyn said. "You hungry?" She stopped. "Yes." Dottie reached under the counter and produced a wrapped piece of cornbread without ceremony, setting it on the counter between them. "That's not for sale. That's just a piece of cornbread." Evelyn took it. "Thank you, Mrs. Marsh." "Dottie," she picked up her measuring tape again. "Welcome to Black Hollow, then." Such as it is. Mrs. Fenwick's boarding house was a narrow two-story building that leaned very slightly to the left, as though it were considering lying down but hadn't committed to it yet. The landlady herself was everything Dottie had suggested, a sharp-eyed woman of indeterminate age who took in Evelyn's appearance at the door with the thoroughness of a customs inspector and the warmth of a January morning. "Name?" Mrs. Fenwick asked, a small ledger already open in her hand. "Evelyn Mercer." "Where from?" "St. Joseph, Missouri, most recently." "Most recently." Mrs. Fenwick's pen paused. "And before that?" "Various places." Evelyn met her eyes. "I've moved around some." Mrs. Fenwick wrote something in her ledger. Evelyn couldn't see what. "Family in the area?" "No." "Husband?" "No." "Employment?" This was the harder question. Evelyn had worked as a seamstress in St. Joseph, and before that as a school teacher in a small town in Illinois, and before that in a laundry in Ohio, and before that in ways she didn't particularly want to discuss with a landlady who was already building a case against her in that ledger. "I'm looking for work," she said. "I can sew. I can keep books. I've done domestic work." Mrs. Fenwick considered this. Then she said, $1.75 a week. Breakfast is at 6:30, supper at 6. No male visitors above the front parlor. I'll have 2 weeks in advance. "I can give you 1 week now," Evelyn said, "and the second at the end of the week." Another pause. Another small war playing out behind those sharp eyes. Then, 1 week now. I'll expect the second by Friday. Evelyn counted out $1.75 from the money in her coat lining. She was aware of how much it cost her, not just in dollars, but in the particular discomfort of handing over nearly 5% of everything she had to a woman who clearly thought the worst of her. But she kept her face calm and her spine straight, and she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Fenwick," and followed the woman upstairs. The room was small. A bed, a dresser, a washstand, a window that looked out onto the alley behind the building where someone had left a broken cartwheel leaning against the fence. The quilt on the bed was thin. The floor creaked. When Mrs. Fenwick left, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window for a while. Then she unpacked her carpet bag with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Practical, ordered, no time wasted on feelings she couldn't afford. She had 3 dresses, one of which was too nice for wherever she'd ended up and would need to be kept wrapped. 2 sets of underclothes, a pair of sturdier boots she'd bought in Kansas City, which she did not regret spending the money on, a small folding knife that had been her mother's, a book she'd been carrying for 2 years without managing to finish it, and the letter, which she took out, looked at for a moment, and then used to start a fire in the small iron stove in the corner of the room. It caught slowly, then all at once, the way betrayal does when you finally let yourself feel it. She watched it burn until there was nothing left but ash. Then she put on her heavier coat and went to find out if this town had any work for a woman who knew how to keep her head down and her hands busy. She heard about Rowan Hale before she saw him. She'd been in Black Hollow 4 days. 4 days of asking carefully at the general store and the land office and the one modest restaurant on the main street. 4 days of being looked at with that particular mixture of pity and suspicion that seemed to be the town's default setting for lone women of uncertain origin. She'd picked up a few days of mending work from Dottie Marsh, whose eyes were going and who had a pile of shirts and trousers that needed attention. It was enough to keep her through the week, maybe into the next one if she was careful, but it wasn't enough to build anything on. She was eating supper at Mrs. Fenwick's, a thin beef stew with bread that had been better 2 days ago, when she first heard the name. "The Hale order came in," said the other boarder, a young man named Cletus who worked at the land office and spoke mostly in the manner of someone reporting rather than conversing. 6 months of provisions. Mrs. Fenwick made a sound somewhere between acknowledgement and disapproval. "That man orders 6 months at a time because he can't stand coming to town more than twice a year." "Can't blame him," Cletus said, which seemed to be the limit of his opinion on the matter, and went back to his stew. Evelyn, who had learned to listen to conversations she wasn't included in, said nothing. Later, washing her own dish in the kitchen because it was one of Mrs. Fenwick's rules, She heard Dottie Marsh's voice in the front room. Dottie had come by to return a borrowed pattern book and caught the name again. Hale's order. Cyrus is having it delivered out tomorrow. You want to send anything with the wagon? Nothing I need from that direction, Mrs. Fenwick said. Though I'll say this, he keeps his accounts current. That's more than I can say for half the men in this county. He's a hard man, Dottie said. Fair, but hard. Lost his wife, 3 years ago now? 4. Little girl with her. It was the fever. That would harden anyone. Some it hardens, Mrs. Fenwick said. Some it breaks. Hale got hard. I suppose that's the better outcome. She did not sound entirely convinced of this. Evelyn filed the name away and went upstairs. She met him on the 5th day, under circumstances that she would later describe, when she described them at all, as inauspicious. She'd gone out early before breakfast because she hadn't been sleeping well and walking helped. The town was quiet in that pre-dawn way that made it almost tolerable. No one looking at her, no conversations to navigate, just the cold and the faint gray light and the sound of her boots on the frozen ground. She'd walked further than she intended, past the end of the main street and along the wagon road that led north out of town, and she was coming back when she heard it. A horse in distress. Not panicked, not that full-throated screaming that sets your teeth on edge, but something quieter and worse. A horse in pain, making a low sound that was almost too deep to be called a cry. She found it, and him, in the shallow ditch beside the road. The horse had caught its forelegs somehow, and the rider had come down with it. The horse was lying at an unnatural angle, still making that sound, and the man was on his knees beside it in the ditch, his hat gone, one hand braced against the horse's neck. Evelyn's first thought was practical. That horse needed help, and there was no one else here. "Is it the leg?" she asked. The man's head came up fast. He had not heard her approach. In the thin light, she could see that he was somewhere in his 30s, broad across the shoulders, with several days of dark beard and a long pale scar running from his left cheekbone toward his jaw, old enough to have turned silver white, the kind of scar you stop noticing on your own face. He looked at her with an expression that she couldn't immediately read, because it was several things at once. Surprise, wariness, something that might have been irritation at being found in this position. "The leg," he confirmed, his voice flat. "She went down in the ice. I think it's just a strain, not a break. Can she stand?" "Haven't tried yet. I was waiting for her to settle." Evelyn set down the small basket she'd brought. She'd been planning to collect some dried herbs she'd spotted growing along the road bank, a habit from years of making do with what was available, and came down into the ditch. The horse flinched when she got close. Evelyn moved slowly, keeping her body low, letting the animal hear her breathing and decide it was not a threat. She'd been around horses most of her life, in the way that people who grow up poor in rural places are around horses. Not as beloved companions, but as tools that needed managing. And like most tools, they responded better to patience than to force. "Easy," she said, not to the man, to the horse. "Easy now. Nobody's rushing you." She ran her hand along the leg from knee to ankle, feeling for the swelling. The horse trembled under her hands but didn't pull away. "Strain," she said. "Bad one, but not a break. You'll want to get her off this leg." "I know that." His voice had an edge to it that she recognized. The voice of a capable person in an embarrassing situation, overcompensating for the embarrassment with irritation. She'd heard it before. She did not take it personally. "If I take her head," she said, "can you get under her shoulder?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." It took several minutes and a fair amount of work, and Evelyn ended up with mud on her coat and one knee soaked through from the ditch water. And the horse nearly went down again twice before they got her standing. But they got her standing, and once she was up, the leg bore weight, which confirmed what Evelyn had said about the break. The man stood beside the horse, one hand on its neck, and looked at Evelyn. There was something different in his expression now. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of the earlier dismissal, like he'd adjusted something in a private equation. "Rowan Hale," he said, by way of introduction, the way men out here introduce themselves, last name included, no apology for its lateness. "Evelyn Mercer." "You passing through?" "I thought so," she said. "Now I'm less sure." He looked at her coat, which was decent but not warm enough for this country, and at her boots, which were better. At the basket she'd put down in the ditch, which contained a pair of scissors, some twine, and several dried sprigs of something that he probably couldn't identify. At her face, which she kept neutral while he looked. "You know anything about ranch work?" he asked. It was not a question she'd expected. "Some," she said carefully. "I grew up on a farm in Illinois. Smaller scale than what you've got out here, I'd guess, but I know the principles." "I need someone at the ranch," he said, in the tone of a man who had arrived at this decision somewhere in the last 3 minutes and was already slightly annoyed with himself for it. "Not a hand. I've got a hand. Someone who can keep the house and help with the records and not require a great deal of—" He paused. "Managing." Evelyn looked at him. "What happened to the last person?" Something shifted in his face. There wasn't one. Not for 4 years. She thought about Mrs. Fenwick's boarding house, and the thin quilt, and the $41 minus the room cost and the food she'd had to buy. She thought about the mending pile at Dottie's shop, which would run out by the end of the week. "What does it pay?" she asked. He named a figure. It was modest but honest, and it came with room and board, which more than doubled its value. "I'll want to see the place first," she said. He blinked, as though this condition had not occurred to him. "Fair enough," he said, after a moment. She picked up her basket. He took the horse's lead. They walked back toward town without saying much else, which suited them both, though neither of them knew that yet. She saw it for the first time 2 days later, when Rowan came to town for his provisions order, and she rode out with him in the wagon. Hale Ridge Ranch sat on a rise about 8 miles north of Black Hollow, and it was clear from the approach that it had once been something more and was now something less. The main house was solid, 2 stories built from timber that had weathered well, with a porch that ran the full front width. But there was an outbuilding to the east that had partially collapsed and hadn't been repaired, and the fence lines she could see from the road were overdue for mending. The yard had the particular look of a place where one person was maintaining what 2 or 3 people should be maintaining, which was functional but fraying. The hand Rowan had mentioned turned out to be a man named Ike, who was perhaps 60, with the kind of body that had been lean and strong for 40 years, and was now slowly cashing in those deposits. He looked at Evelyn from under a battered hat brim with the specific expression of a man who had opinions but had learned to keep them at a low temperature. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Ike," she said. "Just Ike." He glanced at Rowan. "She staying?" "Looking at it," Rowan said. Ike looked back at Evelyn for a moment longer, then nodded and went back to unloading the wagon, which seemed to constitute his seal of acceptance, or at least his concession that the question was not his to answer. Rowan showed her the house. It was large enough for the 3 of them. 4 rooms upstairs, a kitchen and sitting room, and what had been a dining room and was now primarily used for storage. The room she'd use was at the back, smaller than the one at Mrs. Fenwick's, but warmer, with a solid door that latched properly and a window that looked out over the back pasture where 24 cattle moved slowly in the morning light. She stood at that window for a moment. "It's not much," Rowan said from the doorway, and she heard in his voice something that was not quite apology, but was adjacent to it. "It's enough," she said. And she meant it. She had long ago stopped measuring enough against what she'd hoped for and started measuring it against what she'd actually had. She moved her things from the boarding house the next morning. Mrs. Fenwick did not seem sorry to see her go, Sun. The first weeks were the hardest because they were learning each other in the way that strangers forced into proximity have to learn each other. Not through conversation, but through observation. Through the 10,000 small negotiations that happen without words when 2 people share space and labor. She learned that Rowan woke at 4:30 every morning without fail, moved through the house with the minimal noise of a man who had once had someone else sleeping who he didn't want to wake, and drank his coffee black and alone at the kitchen table for 20 minutes before he spoke to anyone. She learned to have the coffee ready and then be elsewhere. He learned that she did not need instructions, that she would look at what needed doing and do it, and that she had opinions about how things should be done and would offer them once, just once, and then let it go if he disagreed. He learned, after a while, to pay attention to that once, because she was usually right. The cattle work she'd said she knew something about, she knew more than something about. She was not as strong as a man, and she didn't pretend otherwise, but she was methodical, and she didn't panic, and she learned fast. The first time a steer broke through a fence, and she helped Rowan run it down and get it back without either of them getting hurt, she saw something cross his face that might, under different circumstances, have been respect. He didn't say so, but she saw it. She kept the house accounts because Rowan's system was a collection of receipts in a coffee tin and several pages of numbers in a handwriting that she had to study for a full day before she could decode it. She organized these into a proper ledger, identified 3 places where he'd been consistently overcharged by a supplier in town, and left the ledger on the kitchen table with a note marking the relevant entries. When he came in that evening and found it, he was quiet for a long time. "I've been paying Morton Jacobs an extra 12% on leather goods for 2 years, he said finally. "Not a question." "Since March of 1881, based on the records," she said. "His prices on everything else are fair. I think it might be an error, or it might not be." Rowan looked at the ledger again. "It's not an error," he said, which told her more about the town and Rowan's place in it than a week of conversation might have done. "Then you'll want to address it," she said. "I will." He closed the ledger, opened it again, closed it. "Thank you." It was, she would realize later, the first time he'd said those words to her for anything other than passing the salt. Black Hollow had opinions about Evelyn Mercer. She discovered this in stages, because opinions in small frontier towns rarely come at you directly. They come at you sideways, in pauses and glances, and the particular way conversations shift when you walk into a room. She'd been navigating this kind of social terrain since she was 17 years old and had learned to read the signs the way you learn to read weather, not to stop it, just to know it was coming. The first shape the opinion took was curiosity, which she could work with. The women at the dry goods counter talking a little too loudly about that woman out at Hale's place, wondering aloud whether Rowan had lost his senses entirely. Cletus at the land office, who she encountered sometimes when she came to town for supplies, looking at her with the slightly wounded expression of a young man whose limited understanding of women had been complicated by her existence. The second shape was more pointed. She was at Dottie's shop. She still came in occasionally for mending work, both because she needed the extra income and because Dottie was the closest thing she had to a friend in this town, when a woman came in whose name was Harriet Weld. Harriet Weld was the wife of the town's largest landowner, which gave her a social authority she exercised with the thoroughness of someone who'd been waiting all her life for exactly this much power. Harriet looked at Evelyn with a smile that had no warmth in it whatsoever and said, "Miss Mercer, we were just saying we hadn't seen you in town lately. I suppose you've been keeping busy." "Busy enough," Evelyn said, and continued folding the muslin she'd been working with. "How do you find ranch work?" Harriet asked. "It must be so different from what you were used to." "It suits me," Evelyn said. "Well," Harriet arranged her gloves on the counter, "I'm sure Rowan is grateful for the company. He's been so alone out there, the poor man. It's wonderful that he's found someone to keep the house." The pause before keep the house did all the work that the words themselves were designed to deny. Evelyn looked up from the muslin. She looked at Harriet Weld directly and with full attention, the way she'd learned to look at people who were being unkind in polished, plausibly deniable ways. "It is wonderful," she said pleasantly. "Ranch work is honest work, and I'm glad to have it. I'll tell Rowan you asked after him." Harriet's smile stayed exactly where it was, which was how Evelyn knew she'd drawn blood. She told Dottie about it afterward because Dottie was the sort of woman who preferred things said plainly. "Harriet Weld's been wanting Rowan to marry her niece from Cheyenne for the past 2 years, Dottie said. "She's not against you personally, she's against the inconvenience of you." "That's a distinction without much difference from where I'm standing." "No," Dottie admitted. "I suppose it's not." She threaded a needle with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "You want my advice?" "If you want to give it." "Ignore Harriet. Do your work. Don't apologize for being where you are." She paused. "People out here respect 2 things, usefulness and backbone. You've got both. The rest will sort itself out eventually, or it won't, and either way you'll still be standing." Evelyn considered this. "That's practical advice." "I'm a practical woman." Dottie bit the thread. "Rowan Hale is a decent man under all that frost. He wouldn't have taken you on if he didn't believe you were worth the trouble." "I'm not sure he thought about it that carefully," Evelyn said. "I think he needed someone, and I was there." "Maybe," Dottie said, "but he's kept you on. And Rowan doesn't keep anything he doesn't find worthwhile. The frost she'd mentioned was real. That was the thing about Rowan Hale. Not that he was cruel, because he wasn't. And not that he was unkind, because he had moments, small and carefully rationed, that weren't. But he kept himself at a consistent and very precise distance from everyone around him, including, in a different way, Ike, who'd known him for 7 years and still addressed him as boss without irony. The distance was not hostility. It was more like a deliberate choice, the way you choose to build your house back from the cliff edge because you've already lost something to the drop. Evelyn understood this in an abstract way without understanding it fully, because she didn't know yet about the wife. She'd heard Mrs. Fenwick mention it, but hearing about a dead wife and understanding what that death meant to the man who survived it were different kinds of knowing. She understood it better the evening she went looking for a cooking pot in the storage room off the kitchen and found, behind a crate of old fence staples, a small wooden box. She wasn't snooping, she wasn't made that way. And she would have left it alone entirely except that it was in the way of what she needed, and she had to move it. And when she picked it up, the lid shifted and she saw briefly the corner of a photograph. She put the box back where she'd found it, exactly as she'd found it, and went and found a different pot. But the image stayed with her, the corner of a woman's face, and beside it, just visible, the edge of something small, a child's hand maybe, or a shoe. She didn't mention it. She wouldn't have known how to, and it wasn't hers to mention. But after that, she understood the distance a little better, and she stopped finding it cold. She'd been at Hale Ridge for nearly 2 months when the letter arrived. Not from Thomas Paine. She had not expected anything more from him and had not been disappointed by the absence. No, this letter had been forwarded through 2 post offices before it found her, which meant it had been looking for a while. It came from a woman named Clara Briggs, who had been a neighbor of Evelyn's family in Ohio many years ago, and who had recently, in the way of small world coincidences that feel larger than they are, run into Thomas Paine's new wife at a social function in Cincinnati. Clara was not a mean woman, but she was a thorough one. She reported what she'd learned with the diligence of someone who believed that knowledge, even painful knowledge, was always better than ignorance. Thomas Paine had been married since October. His wife was the daughter of a successful manufacturer, which explained everything. He was living in Cincinnati, where his father's business had a branch office. He was, by all accounts, thriving, and Clara had heard, she couldn't say where, rumors traveled such strange paths, that Evelyn had come west following him. She wanted Evelyn to know that she thought this very brave, and that she hoped things were going well, and that she'd always thought Thomas Paine was a small man in the ways that mattered, and Evelyn deserved better. Evelyn read the letter twice, sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning before Rowan came down, and felt not what she'd expected to feel. She'd thought, if the confirmation ever came, that it would hit her like a blow. She'd braced for grief. What she felt instead was a kind of flat, clean anger, and underneath it, surprisingly, something close to relief, because the hope had been the worst of it. Hope was the thing that kept you returning to the wound, and now the hope was definitively over, burned away like the letter she'd put in the stove on her first night in Black Hollow, and without it, she could finally feel the actual shape of where she was. She was at a ranch in Wyoming. She was learning to run a cattle operation. She was earning her own money and sleeping in a warm room, and had a woman named Dottie who was not quite her friend, but was more than an acquaintance and was useful and interesting to talk to. She had a rancher who barely spoke to her but had said thank you 3 times in 2 months, and who, she'd noticed, always made sure there was enough wood by her stove before he went to bed at night. He didn't think she'd noticed. She had. It wasn't what she'd planned. It wasn't anything she'd imagined. But it was real in a way that Thomas Paine had never been, and it was hers in a way that very little had been, and that was something she had not expected to find in a town called Black Hollow on a winter road in Wyoming. She folded the letter from Clara Briggs and put it in the stove. Then she started breakfast. Bretti. Rowan came down at 4:30 and found the coffee ready and Evelyn at the stove, which was the normal arrangement. He poured his coffee and sat at the table and was quiet, which was also normal. What was not entirely normal was that she was not somewhere else. She set his breakfast in front of him, fried salt pork and cornmeal mush, nothing fancy, and sat down across from him with her own coffee. He looked at her briefly, the way he always looked at things that required adjustment, quickly, precisely, filing the information away. "I got a letter yesterday," she said. He waited. About Thomas Paine, the man I came out here to... She paused and chose the honest word. To find. He's married to someone else. Has been since October. Rowan looked at his coffee cup. I see, he said. I wanted to say it plainly because you gave me work without asking too many questions, and I think you deserve to know that I'm not expecting him to appear at any point and complicate things. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I didn't think you were. No, you don't carry yourself like someone waiting for rescue, he said, which was the longest single sentence he'd said to her about herself in 2 months. He seemed aware of this because he picked up his fork and started on his breakfast, which was his way of indicating that the conversation had reached its natural limit. Evelyn drank her coffee. After a while, without looking up from his plate, Rowan said, You're good at this work. She looked at him. The ranch, he said, which she'd understood, but it was worth letting him specify. You learn fast. You don't waste time. Thank you, she said. He nodded, finished his breakfast, took his coffee and his hat, and went out to the day, which was what he always did. She sat at the kitchen table a little longer, watching the light come through the window and fall across the grain of the wood, and thought, I don't know what this is, but I'm still here, and that's not nothing. Outside, the cattle were moving in the pasture. Ike was crossing the yard toward the barn, his breath coming in small clouds. Somewhere out on the north fence line, something needed mending, and she had a ledger to update. And there was a side of leather she'd been oiling back to usability, and the day was full of small, necessary things. She got up. She started doing them. Winter in Wyoming was an education. She'd thought she knew what cold was. She was wrong in the specific way that people who have not experienced something cannot know the ways they are wrong about it. The cold of Missouri was unpleasant. The cold of Black Hollow in January was a condition. It altered the terms of daily life the way a flood alters the terms of a house. Everything's still there, but different, working differently, carrying different weight. The cattle needed checking twice a day. Water troughs froze and had to be broken open with an axe handle. Feed had to be brought out even when the wind was dropping ice crystals at a 45-degree angle that found the gaps in your collar with the precision of a very small enemy. Ike's hip, which gave him trouble in ordinary circumstances, became unreliable in the deep cold, and so Evelyn quietly absorbed more of the outdoor work than had been originally discussed. Not making a point of it, just doing it, the way you do things that need to be done. Rowan noticed. He noticed the way he noticed everything, without comment, but thoroughly. One morning, at roughly 3:30 in the morning, she heard sounds from downstairs that were not Rowan's normal early morning sounds. She came down to find him at the kitchen table with his coat still on, cleaning and rebandaging his left hand, which had a long gash across 3 knuckles that she could see from the doorway was deeper than it should be left untreated. What happened? She asked. Wire, he said. Fence section on the east. Broke in the night and a steer got out. Did you get the steer? Yes. And the fence? Temporary repair. It'll need proper work when it's light. She crossed to the kitchen, found the box of medical supplies. She'd organized these 2 weeks in because they'd been scattered across 3 different drawers, and brought them to the table. She sat across from him and looked at the hand. You missed this part, she said, indicating where the bandage hadn't covered the worst of the cut. I noticed. Can I? Yes, he said, which was quicker than she'd expected. She cleaned the wound properly and rebandaged it with the economy of someone who'd done this kind of thing before. Not medically trained, but experienced in the way that people who've gotten by on their own for a long time get experienced in small necessary competencies. Rowan sat still and let her work. You've done this before, he said. Some. She cut the bandage and tied it off. My mother was sickly when I was a teenager. I got used to managing things when she couldn't. He didn't ask more, but he didn't look away either, and she was aware of him watching her in that direct, unornamented way he had. Not intrusive, but completely present, the way a person looks when they're actually trying to understand something rather than just observing it. Your hand will be stiff tomorrow, she said. You'll want to keep it as warm as you can. I know. I'll take the morning check on the herd, she said. You can do the fence when it's light. He started to say something and stopped. I know the pasture, she said, anticipating the objection. I've been doing the morning check 3 times a week since Ike's hip started acting up. I know the count and I know which animals to watch. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said, and then, be careful of the east corner. The ground's uneven under the snow in that area. Hard to see. I'll look out for it. She put on her coat and her heaviest mittens and went out into the 4 o'clock dark. And she found the herd exactly where she expected to find it. And she counted them by lamplight while her breath made small clouds and her feet went numb, and the stars overhead were so sharp and close they felt dangerous. All present. The temporary fence patch was holding. When she came back in, Rowan was still at the table. All there, she said, hanging up her coat. He nodded. Coffee's fresh. She poured herself a cup and sat down across from him again, and they sat in the quiet of the kitchen while the stove cracked and settled, and outside the wind moved against the windows in long waves, and neither of them said anything for a while. But it was a different kind of quiet than it had been when she first came. Not the careful, suspicious quiet of two strangers managing their distance. Something else. Something that didn't need a name yet, and wouldn't get one for a long time. And that was fine. That was, she thought, watching the fire through the grate of the stove, more than fine. She finished her coffee and washed her cup and went back to bed. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Wyoming, she fell asleep without lying awake first, thinking about how everything had gone wrong. Some things, she was learning, didn't announce themselves. They just arrived, quiet and without ceremony, and settled in like they'd always been there. She slept until 5:30, when Ike started moving around in his room off the barn, and the ranch woke up around her, and the day began. Spring came to Hale Ridge the way it comes to high country. Not all at once, not with any particular announcement, but in increments so small you almost missed them. A morning where the cold didn't bite quite as hard. An afternoon where the snow pulled back from the south-facing slope of the yard, revealing the dark mud underneath like something the winter had been hiding. The first week of March brought 2 days of actual sunlight, and Evelyn stood on the porch in the middle of the second afternoon with her sleeves rolled and her face tilted up, and Ike walked past and said without stopping, "Don't get used to it. She'll turn again before the week's out." He was right. It did turn. But something else didn't turn back, and that was the rhythm they had found, the three of them, in the long, hard months between November and now. The ranch had a pulse to it that Evelyn had learned to read, the way you learn to read the breathing of a sleeping person in the same room. Not by thinking about it, but by existing near it long enough that the information simply moved into you. She knew, without checking, when the steer in the east pasture was favoring his left foreleg again. She knew which section of fence needed attention before the spring thaw turned the ground soft and the posts started shifting. She knew that Ike's hip was worse in the morning than in the afternoon, and that he would never say so, and that the best way to manage this was to arrange the day's work so that the heaviest outdoor tasks fell in the early afternoon without making it obvious that she was arranging anything. And she knew, with a quieter kind of knowing that she didn't examine too closely, that Rowan Hale left a lamp burning in the kitchen window on the nights when she went to town and came back late, even though the road was straight, and she knew it well and had never asked for the lamp. She did not mention the lamp. He did not mention it either. That was its own kind of language, and she was learning to speak it. What she had not expected coming into spring was how much harder the thaw would be than the freeze. Winter, she discovered, had a clarifying effect. When survival was the primary business of every day, everything else simplified. You did not have time or energy for complications that weren't physical. But spring loosened things. It brought the mud and the longer light and the particular restlessness that comes when a body has been locked down for months. And with the restlessness came all the complications that winter had been holding in storage. The first complication was the town. She'd been managing Black Hollow's opinion of her at a careful distance, coming in for supplies when she needed to, stopping at Dottie's, keeping her interactions brief and her expression neutral. But Dottie had told her, in early March, that the talk had shifted in character. It was no longer just curiosity or the particular resentment of Harriet Weld. It had taken on a harder edge, the kind that comes when a rumor stops being a question and becomes a statement. "What are they saying?" Evelyn asked, because she believed in knowing things plainly. Dottie set down her scissors. "That you're not there as a housekeeper." "I see." "That Rowan Hale has lost whatever judgment he had left." Dottie paused. "And that a woman traveling alone with your sort of Background. Likely has reasons for it that decent folks oughtn't make themselves comfortable with. Your sort of background. Evelyn sat with those words for a moment, feeling their shape. What background do they think I have? Nothing specific. That's what makes it worse. Specific rumors have edges. Vague ones just spread. Dottie looked at her steadily. I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because I think you should know, and because I think you're going to hear it more directly before long, and I'd rather you weren't caught unprepared. Thank you, Evelyn said. I mean that. I know you do. Dottie picked up her scissors again. For what it's worth, I've watched you work for 4 months now. You're honest and you're capable and you don't complain. That's more than I can say for half the people in this town who have perfectly respectable histories. It was, Evelyn thought, more than she'd expected anyone out here to say to her. It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. It did anyway. She went back to the ranch that afternoon and did not mention it to Rowan because it was not the kind of thing that could be said without raising questions she wasn't ready to answer about her own history. The town's vague suspicions were close enough to certain specific truths that she did not want to invite closer inspection. This was the thing about the past. It didn't need to be present to be dangerous. It just needed to be possible. Rowan noticed she was quieter than usual that evening. He didn't ask directly. He rarely asked directly about anything that touched on feeling, but at supper he poured coffee for both of them without her asking, which was unusual, and he sat at the table a little longer than he normally did before going out to do the evening check. Something happened in town? He said finally. Nothing serious, she said, which was partly true. He looked at her for a moment in the way he had. That direct, measuring look that she'd stopped finding unsettling and started finding, against her better judgment, something closer to steadying. Then he nodded and took his coffee and went out. She washed the supper dishes and thought about how strange it was that the opinion of a town full of people who barely knew her could make her feel so scraped clean on the inside, while one wordless nod from a man who said almost nothing could put something back. She wasn't sure what to do with that observation, so she did what she usually did with observations she wasn't sure about. She filed it away and let time do the work of making sense of it. The second complication arrived on a Tuesday in early April, in the form of a knock at the ranch door at 7 in the morning. She opened it to find a boy. He was perhaps 10 or 11, though hunger had that effect of making children look both younger and older than they were, so she couldn't be certain. He was slight, with dark eyes that held the specific watchfulness of someone who had learned that most situations required assessment before trust. His coat was too small. The cuffs sat 3 inches above his wrists, and his boots had been resoled with something that wasn't meant for boot leather, and he was carrying nothing except a canvas sack that held, by the look of it, very little. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Is this the Hale place?" he asked. His voice was careful, like someone who had rehearsed this question. "It is," she said. "I heard there might be work." "Who told you that?" A small hesitation. "Man at the livery, in town." Evelyn considered him for a moment. He met her eyes without flinching, which she noted. "What's your name?" "Elias." "Last name?" Another hesitation, shorter than the first. "Webb." "How old are you, Elias Webb?" 12, he said, which she thought might be true. "I can work. I'm not afraid of animals, and I learn quick." "Where are your people?" she asked, keeping her voice level, the way you keep your voice level around a stray animal you're not yet sure of. Something crossed his face. Not grief exactly, but the place where grief had been and hardened over. "Don't have any," he said. She looked at him standing there on the porch in his too small coat in the April wind. She thought about what Dottie had said about decent folks and questionable histories. She thought about the fact that she'd had nowhere to stand either, not so long ago, and that the man inside this house had let her stand somewhere anyway, without requiring a full account of how she'd come to need the standing. "Come inside," she said. "I'll get you breakfast and we'll talk to the man who actually runs this place." Elias Webb came inside, and he sat at the kitchen table, and she put cornbread and cold beans in front of him, and he ate with the disciplined restraint of someone who was starving, but had decided that eating too fast would reveal how starving he was. She watched him eat and said nothing about it. When Rowan came in from the morning check, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the boy. Then he looked at Evelyn. "This is Elias," she said. He's looking for work. Rowan's expression was unreadable, which was its normal condition. He took off his hat and hung it on the peg by the door and poured himself coffee before he said anything. How old? He asked. 12, Elias said, and said it directly to Rowan, which Evelyn noted he'd read the room correctly, understood who made the decisions. Family? No, sir. Rowan sat down at the table across from the boy. This was notable because Rowan rarely sat when he could stand and rarely engaged when he could observe. He put his coffee down and looked at Elias with that same direct assessment he brought to everything. What can you do? He asked. I can muck stalls and carry feed and fix fence if someone shows me how. I'm good with horses. They don't spook around me. I can read and I can do sums. Elias paused. I don't steal and I don't lie when it matters. When it matters, Rowan said, which was the closest he came to noting the precision of the qualifier. I might not tell you everything, Elias said, with a seriousness that was somehow both a 10-year-old's honesty and something older. But I won't tell you what's not true. Rowan was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. You'd sleep in the room off the barn. It's Ike's, but Ike doesn't use it anymore. He's moved to the smaller room in the house. Elias nodded, very carefully not showing relief. You'd eat with us, and you'd work when there's work, which is most of the time. Wages are low because you're young, and I don't know yet what you're worth. He looked at the boy evenly. If it turns out you're worth more, I'll pay more. I don't cheat on wages. Yes, sir, Elias said. Rowan looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back at him. Something passed between them, not a conversation, but the compressed version of one. And then Rowan stood up and took his coffee and said, Ike's in the barn. Tell him I said to show you the stalls. Elias Webb got up from the table with the careful movements of someone who was managing the size of what had just happened. At the door, he stopped and looked back at Evelyn. Thank you, he said, for the food. You're welcome, she said. He went out. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him cross the yard toward the barn, still carrying the canvas sack, still in the too small coat. He's hiding something, Rowan said from behind her. I know, she said. So is everyone who ends up out here. He didn't answer that, but he didn't disagree with it either, and that, she'd learned, was its own kind of answer. By the end of the first week, Elias had made himself useful in the quiet, industrious way of children who understand that usefulness is a form of safety. He was good with the horses, better than he'd claimed, actually, and he had a particular aptitude for fence repair that Ike, after 3 days of supervision, declared sufficient to work unsupervised on the simple sections. He ate everything put in front of him, still with that careful restraint, still not taking more than what was given, and at night he slept in Ike's old room off the barn, and did not, as far as any of them could tell, cause any trouble. He was also watching all of them with those dark, assessing eyes, the way children who have been through hard things watch the adults around them, always looking for the signs of what's coming, always reading the temperature of the room. Evelyn noticed because she'd done the same thing herself, at roughly his age, in her mother's house. You learned to watch when watching was all you had. She started teaching him in the evenings. Not formally, she wasn't in a position to run a schoolroom, but she'd sit at the kitchen table after supper and he'd sit across from her, and she'd work through whatever needed working through. Arithmetic that could be applied to the ranch accounts, some history, some writing. He was quick, as he'd said, and he had the particular hunger for knowledge of someone who'd been denied regular access to it and knew exactly how much it mattered. Rowan watched this from the other side of the kitchen, where he worked on tack repairs or went over the ranch accounts, and said nothing. But he didn't stop it, and he didn't leave the room, which was its own form of endorsement. One evening, about 3 weeks after Elias arrived, Evelyn looked up from the table to find him watching her instead of the sums she'd set him. What? She asked. Where'd you learn all this? He asked. The schooling stuff. I was a teacher for a few years, she said, before other things. What other things? Elias, gently. Sorry, he said, and meant it. He looked back at his sums. Then, without looking up, did you always know how to do what you do out here? With the cattle and the fences and all? No, she said. I learned it here. Who taught you? She glanced across the room to where Rowan was bent over the tack, And she said, "Nobody really. I watched, and I did, and when I got something wrong, I tried to figure out why." Elias absorbed this. "Is that how most things work?" "Most things," she said. "The ones worth learning." He went back to his sums. Across the room, she was almost certain she heard the faintest change in the rhythm of Rowan's work. A pause, a resumption, though she could have been imagining it. She turned back to her own writing and did not make anything of it. There were a lot of things like that, small moments she didn't make anything of, that she was nonetheless keeping somewhere, stored in a part of herself she hadn't examined closely yet. April became May, and May brought new grass and new calves and the kind of work that needed every available hand from sunup to past sundown. The calving was hard. 3 births in a single week, one of them difficult enough to require Rowan on his knees in the mud of the barn at 2 a.m, sleeves pushed up, while Evelyn held the lamp and Elias, who'd been woken by the noise and come in without being asked, held the animal's head and talked to it in a low, steady voice that was remarkable in its steadiness, given that he was 12 and this was large and loud and not for the faint of anything. The calf came out wrong end first and they lost it. Rowan sat back on his heels in the mud, forearms on his knees, and said nothing for a moment. Evelyn kept the lamp steady. Elias was very quiet. "You did everything right," Evelyn said to Rowan. He didn't answer. He was looking at the barn floor. "Some things don't come out right even when you do everything right," she said. "That's the animal of it." He looked up at her. There was something in his face that she wasn't prepared for. Not grief, not quite, but something close to it, something raw and briefly visible that she'd never seen on him before. Then he blinked and it was gone. And he was standing up and cleaning his hands on a rag and telling Elias to get back to bed and going about the business of managing the aftermath. But she'd seen it, and she thought of the box behind the fence staples and the corner of a photograph and the edge of a child's shoe. She didn't say anything. She went back to the house and put the lamp on the kitchen table and sat down for a while in the quiet, listening to the ranch settle around her. After a while, she heard Rowan come in, heard the wash basin, heard his boots on the stairs. Then she heard them stop. She heard him come back down. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in his work clothes, his hair damp from washing. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. He came in and sat down at the table, not across from her, at the other end, which maintained the usual geography of their evenings. He didn't pour coffee, he just sat. They stayed like that for a while, not speaking, with the lamp burning between them and the dark outside the windows and the ranch quiet except for the wind. "Her name was Vera," he said, eventually. The words came out with the particular careful effort of something that hadn't been said aloud in a long time. "My wife. And my daughter was Clara. She was 3. Evelyn did not say I'm sorry, because she'd found that those words, while true, were often the wrong shape for moments like this one. She said, "What was she like?" "Vera." He thought about this for a moment. "Stubborn," he said. "She had opinions about everything, and she was right about most of them, and she knew it." A pause. "She laughed too loud. It used to embarrass me in company. I miss it like—" He stopped. "Like a sound you can't get back," Evelyn said quietly. He looked at her. "Yes. Clara?" She looked like her mother, that same. She had a look when she was working something out, like she was solving a problem nobody else could see. He was quiet for a long moment. "The fever came fast. Both of them in the same week. The doctor came out from town, but it didn't matter." "I'm sorry," Evelyn said, because there it was, the right shape after all. He nodded. He looked at the lamp. "I kept the place because I didn't know what else to do with myself," he said. "And then after a while it was just what I did. The ranch, the cattle. It gave me somewhere to put." He made a small gesture with his hand, indicating the vast and unmanageable weight of what was left when everything else was taken. "Something to manage." "I understand that," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "I know you do." The lamp burned. Outside, somewhere, a nightbird made its particular sound, twice, then went quiet. "She would have liked you," Rowan said, which was perhaps the most unexpected thing he'd ever said to her, and which landed in a part of her she couldn't immediately identify. "Vera, She had no patience for people who didn't have the guts to be what they were. She would have thought you were direct enough. Evelyn didn't know how to answer that, so she said the thing that was true. That might be the finest compliment I've received since I came out west. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not yet, maybe not for a while, but the acknowledgement that a smile existed somewhere in the vicinity. Go to sleep, Evelyn, he said, and pushed back his chair. Good night, Rowan, she said. She heard his boots on the stairs, heard the door of his room close. She sat for a moment with the lamp between her hands, feeling the warmth of it against her palms, and she thought, something is different now. I'm not sure what to do with different, but it's there. She turned down the lamp and went to bed. June came in warm and full of noise, cattle, wind, the creak of the house adjusting to the heat after months of cold, Elias growing what seemed like an inch every 3 weeks and eating accordingly. Ike's commentary on the state of the South pasture delivered each morning in roughly the same tone he'd used to report on the weather. The ranch had a fullness to it now that Evelyn recognized as the accumulated weight of people learning each other, slowly, imperfectly, with all the friction that entailed. She and Rowan argued twice in June. The first time was about the hay supplier. She thought they should switch to a farm 20 miles north whose prices were better and whose quality Dottie's husband, who ran the freight, had vouched for. Rowan thought the relationship with the current supplier, who'd been providing for Hale Ridge since before Vera died, carried a loyalty worth paying for. They went back and forth on this across the supper table on a Wednesday evening with Elias watching them the way he watched everything, quietly, carefully, storing the information. You're paying for sentiment, Evelyn said, which was perhaps too direct. I'm paying for reliability, Rowan said, which was not wrong either. The new farm has been reliable for 4 years according to everyone who uses them. According to your friend Dottie's husband, who has no reason to mislead me. Who has the business interest of moving freight for the northern farms? She stopped. He was right about that. She hadn't thought through the second layer of the interest, and the fact that she hadn't annoyed her more than his being right about it did. Fine, she said. That's a fair point. He looked at her as though he'd expected continued argument and was recalibrating. It's not a bad idea, he said after a moment. The northern farm. I'll look into it myself before the fall order. It was a compromise that cost them both something, which was probably the correct outcome for the argument. The second disagreement was sharper and left more of a mark. She'd been working on the ranch books and found, in going through the full year's accounts, that there was a significant note coming due in October. A loan taken out 3 years ago against the ranch, which she hadn't known about. It was not an unreasonable debt, given the circumstances, but the terms were tighter than she'd realized, and if the fall cattle sale came in below last year's prices, which it might, given the weather they'd been having, the margin was thinner than she was comfortable with. She raised it at supper because it seemed important and immediate enough to raise. I saw the note coming due in October, she said. Rowan went very still. I'm not prying into your finances, she said carefully, but I'm keeping the books, and the books have a problem that affects how we should be thinking about the fall sale. Those are my finances, he said, and the temperature in the room dropped. I know, she said, and I'm telling you about them because you pay me to know what's in the books, and what's in the books affects decisions we make together about the operation of this ranch. Decisions I make, he said, about my ranch. She held his gaze. Rowan, I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to give you information you need. I know about the note, he said. All right. She kept her voice even. Then you know the margin on the fall sale matters more than usual this year. I'm aware of that. And you have a plan for it. I have a plan for it, she nodded. Good. She picked up her fork. I'm sorry for overstepping. I'll make a note in the ledger for the due date. He ate in silence for the rest of the meal. Elias ate with the focused attention of someone who was determining precisely how much of this he should have seen and heard. Ike, who was immune to domestic weather of all kinds, ate with the same steady efficiency he brought to everything. Later, it was late, Ike and Elias both long asleep, she was sewing in the kitchen when she heard Rowan come back down the stairs. She did not look up. He crossed to the kitchen, poured water from the pitcher, drank. I'm sorry, he said from the sink. She looked up then. He was looking at the window, his back to her. You weren't overstepping. You were doing the job. A pause. I'm not used to sharing the weight of it, the worrying about it. I've been doing it alone for 4 years, and I got used to that being the only way it could work. I understand that, she said. I know. He turned around. In the lamplight, he looked tired, not just tonight tired, but the deeper, longer kind. The plan for the note is solid. The fall sale should cover it, even if prices drop some. There's a buyer from Cheyenne I've been in contact with, more reliable than the Casper market. That's good, she said. But you were right to flag it. He said this with the care of a man who found the admission uncomfortable and was making it anyway. If I hadn't already known, I would have wanted to. She nodded. That's all I wanted, she said, for you to know what you needed to know. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face, something she still didn't have a name for, and then he said goodnight and went back upstairs. She sat in the kitchen for a while, sewing, not thinking about anything in particular, or thinking about everything at once, but in the loose, unfocused way that doesn't feel like thinking. It was the 23rd of June. She'd been at Hale Ridge for 8 months. She'd arrived in Wyoming in the winter, alone, with $41 and a burned letter and no idea what came next. She looked around the kitchen, at the ledger on the corner shelf, at the row of dried herbs she'd hung by the window in April, at Elias's arithmetic primer sitting on the bench by the door, at the rag she'd started using as a pot holder because the original one had finally given up. She was still here. She was still standing. And something, she did not examine it too closely, not yet, was beginning to take the shape of something permanent, of something she had not known she was building, and had built anyway, the way you build things without naming them until they're already standing. She put out the lamp and went to bed, and outside the Wyoming night was warm enough, finally, that she left the window open a crack, and the smell of the summer grass came in, and she was asleep before she'd finished thinking about it. The summer held longer than anyone expected, and September came in warm and golden and deceptively gentle, the kind of weather that makes you lower your guard without realizing you've done it. The fall cattle sale had gone well. The buyer from Cheyenne had been exactly as reliable as Rowan said he would be, and the October note got paid with enough left over that Evelyn was able to order new ledger books and a proper set of account files without feeling like she was spending money that belonged somewhere more urgent. Elias had grown another half-inch. Ike's hip had a good month. The south fence was solid. It was the most settled Evelyn had felt since she could remember, maybe ever. She should have known, from long experience with her own life, that settled was the condition most likely to precede something breaking. The riders came on a Thursday morning in the second week of October, when the first real cold of fall had just started to make itself known, and the aspens on the ridge had gone fully yellow. There were 3 of them, and they came up the wagon road at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual, the deliberate pace of men who knew where they were going and wanted the people there to have time to see them coming, which was itself a kind of message. Evelyn was in the yard when they appeared at the tree line. She had a bucket in each hand and was heading to the water trough in the near pasture, and she stopped when she saw them, the way you stop when something registers as wrong before you've consciously processed what it is. Some part of her, some old, careful, watchful part that had never quite quieted down even in the good months, recognized what she was seeing. She set the buckets down and did not move toward the house. Moving toward the house would tell them she was afraid, and she had learned over many years that fear shown to certain kinds of men was an invitation. The lead rider pulled up at the edge of the yard. He was perhaps 45, with a broad face that might have been pleasant under different circumstances, and was not pleasant now. He was well dressed by frontier standards, good coat, good boots, a hat that hadn't been weathered into shapelessness. He had the look of a man who managed other men and was accustomed to it. "Morning," he said, looking down at her from his horse with the particular ease of someone performing comfort. "Morning," she said. "This the Hale place?" "It is." "I'm looking for a woman named Evelyn Mercer. I was told she's employed here." Something in her went very still. Not cold, past cold, into the deeper country beyond it where things stop moving because motion might give something away. She kept her face precisely where it was. "Can I ask who's asking?" she said. The man smiled. "My name is Garrick Vane. I'm an old acquaintance of Miss Mercer's." He paused. "From before she came west." The name did not hit her like a surprise. It hit her like confirmation of something she had known, Somewhere in the deep back of her mind was always going to find her. The specific, terrible clarity of a thing you've been dreading arriving at last. "Miss Mercer isn't available," she said. "I'd suggest you state your business with the ranch's owner, or move on." Garrick Vane looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the moment he recognized her. Not that he hadn't recognized her before, she thought, but the moment he chose to stop pretending he hadn't. The smile stayed exactly where it was, which was how she knew it wasn't a smile. "Well," he said pleasantly, "that saves us some time." The sound of the barn door was Rowan coming out, which she'd been counting on. He'd been inside and would have heard the horses. He crossed the yard with the unhurried stride of a man who owned the ground he was walking on, and he stopped beside Evelyn and looked up at the three riders with an expression that revealed precisely nothing. "Help you?" he said. "Rowan Hale?" Garrick said. "That's right. Garrick Vane." He didn't offer his hand because to offer his hand he'd have to come down off the horse, and men like Garrick Vane understood the advantage of height. "I have some business with the woman you've been employing. Old matter. I don't expect it'll take long." "What kind of business?" Rowan asked. "Private kind," Garrick said. "Between me and Miss Mercer." Rowan looked at Evelyn. She didn't look back at him, but she felt the question in his attention. The wordless, "Is this something I need to know about right now?" And she gave him nothing, because she didn't yet know what to give. "Anything you have to say to my employee," Rowan said, "you can say in front of me." Garrick's smile shifted almost imperceptibly. "I'd rather not. Out of courtesy to the lady." He looked at Evelyn again. "I think Miss Mercer understands the nature of what I've come about. I'm sure she'd agree that a private conversation is in everyone's best interest." She understood exactly the nature of what he'd come about. "Mr. Vane," she said, "you can say what you've come to say, or you can leave. Those are the options." Something behind his eyes went flat, just for a moment. Then the pleasantness reassembled itself, but it was thinner now, the way a coat of paint looks thin when you can see the wall color coming through. "I'll be in Black Hollow for a few days," he said, addressing her directly now. The courtesy of including Rowan dropped. "I'll give you some time to think. I'd like us to resolve this quietly, Evelyn. That's always been my preference." He looked briefly at Rowan, at the house, at the yard, an inventory she recognized, the kind you do when you're assessing what belongs to someone and whether it constitutes leverage. "I hope you'll take me up on that." He turned his horse. The other two men, who had not spoken a word, followed. They went back down the wagon road at the same deliberate pace, disappearing into the aspens. The yard was quiet. Rowan didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Come inside." Elias was at the far end of the barn. She'd seen him there, watching through the gap in the door, which meant he'd seen everything. She made a small motion with her hand. "Stay there. Stay quiet." He gave the smallest nod. She followed Rowan into the house. He poured water, not coffee, which told her something about where he was putting himself. Something was happening that he wanted to be clear-headed for. He set a glass in front of her and stood on the other side of the table. "Who is he?" Rowan asked. Evelyn sat down. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, just a moment, and then she looked at Rowan. "I need to tell you something," she said, "that I haven't told you before, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide what you think about it." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She told him. It took a while, and she told it plainly, without dressing it up or smoothing the worst of it, because she had learned that dressing things up only meant you had to undress them eventually, and the undressing was always worse. She'd been 16 when her mother died, and the man her mother had been living with, not her father, who'd been gone since Evelyn was 9, was a man named Caleb Rourke. What Caleb Rourke was, underneath the ordinary surface of him, was a predator of a particular kind. Patient, methodical, one who understood that the most effective cage wasn't iron, but dependency. He'd managed her mother with that patience, and after her mother was gone, he'd turned that management toward Evelyn. She'd gotten away. That much she'd managed at 17, putting 2 states between herself and Caleb Rourke and his careful, methodical control. But Rourke had a network that men he did business with, men who owed him things, men like Garrick Vane, who understood that certain kinds of information had value and that a woman alone was always findable if you had the right connections. She'd been in Ohio, 20 years old, and doing laundry work when Rourke found her. He'd sent Vane then, too, as the advance of a particular kind of army, Vane's proposition had been simple: come back, or the stories he carried about her history. The things she'd done to survive, the places she'd worked, the desperate measures of a girl with no options, would follow her wherever she tried to go next. She'd gone. She'd spent 6 months back in Rourke's orbit, doing what was necessary to stay functional, to keep her head, to wait for the moment that came. The moment came on a Tuesday evening in October, 7 years ago. She kept her voice steady. "He came into my room," she said. "I'd locked the door. He had a key." She looked at the table. "I had my mother's folding knife. I always kept it on me. He didn't stop when I told him to stop." She paused. "I stabbed him, twice, in the side. He didn't die immediately. He made it to the door." Another pause. "He died in the hallway." The kitchen was very quiet. "I ran," she said. "I took what I could carry, and I ran, and I've been running ever since. Different names in different places, until I couldn't keep track of who I was supposed to be where, and eventually I stopped changing my name because I was too tired to maintain it." She looked up at Rowan. Garrick Vane was Rourke's man. He found out what happened. He wasn't there for justice. Caleb Rourke was not a man who had friends who wanted justice. He was there because whatever Rourke had been holding over me was now Vane's to hold, because that's how that kind of man works. She stopped talking. There was nothing else to add. Rowan had not moved during any of this. He was sitting exactly as he'd been sitting when she started, forearms on the table, coffee untouched, looking at her. His face was doing several things at once that she couldn't fully read, and she found she couldn't hold his gaze through the silence that followed, so she looked at the window instead, at the aspens on the ridge going gold in the October light. "Say something," she said finally. She didn't mean it to sound as worn as it did. "He doesn't have legal standing," Rowan said. She turned back to him. It was not what she'd expected. "What Rourke did, what you described, that's not something the law is going to pursue on his behalf," Rowan said, and his voice was the careful, deliberate voice of a man thinking through the actual structure of a problem. "Vane's leverage is social, not legal. He's counting on the threat of what people will think, not what a court will do. He's counting on the fact that I'll believe the threat is worse than it is," she said. "Yes." Rowan's jaw was tight. "That's what men like that count on." He was quiet for a moment. "What does he want?" "Money, I'd think, or compliance of some kind. He'll dress it up in terms that sound reasonable. He always does." "You've dealt with him before." "Twice. Before I came west." She looked at the table. "I paid him the first time. I had almost nothing, and I paid him with it. The second time I disappeared before he could finish the negotiation. I've been moving ever since." She paused. "I thought Wyoming was far enough. I thought, I don't know what I thought. That eventually far enough would actually be far enough." Rowan stood up. He went to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking out at the yard. And she watched him from the table and felt the specific dread of someone waiting to be told to leave. To have the thing they'd quietly started to count on pulled away, the way things get pulled away, because that was the pattern she knew. He turned around. "He's not getting anything from you," Rowan said. "Not money, not compliance, not one more inch of ground." His voice was flat and completely certain, the voice he used when he'd made a decision that was finished. "You understand me?" She looked at him for a moment. Something in her chest did something complicated. "This isn't your problem," she said. "I brought it here. I should have told you before. When I came here, I should have—" "You needed work and a place to stand," he said. "You didn't owe me your entire history in exchange for that." "Rowan, you did what you had to do," he said, and it was very quiet when he said it, and very direct. "What he did to you, what Rourke did, that's not a crime on your part. And any man who tries to make you believe it is lying to protect himself." She didn't say anything for a moment. There was a pressure behind her eyes that she was managing carefully. "You might feel differently," she said, "once you've had time to think about it." "I might," he said honestly, "but I don't think so." Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd come in quietly, the way he did everything, and he stood there looking at both of them with those dark, watchful eyes. "I heard," he said, not apologetic, Just honest. Rowan looked at him. I'm not telling anybody, Elias said. I heard. And I think you should know that the third rider, the one on the gray horse, he came around the back of the barn while the other man was talking to you. He was looking at the outbuildings. Rowan's expression sharpened. Counting what we've got, he said. That's what it looked like, Elias said. Evelyn and Rowan looked at each other across the kitchen. He's not just coming to negotiate, she said. No, Rowan said. He's not. What followed was 3 days of a particular kind of tension, the kind that has a shape and a direction, the kind that isn't panic but is its neighbor. Garrick Vane sent a letter by way of a boy from town the following morning. The letter was polite, almost formally so, and it laid out his proposition with the clean logic of a man who'd done this before. It did not mention Caleb Rourke by name. It spoke of certain matters and information that might cause difficulty and a resolution that would serve everyone's interests. It named a sum of money that was almost exactly what Evelyn had earned in her months at the ranch. She showed it to Rowan. He read it twice. He knows what you've made here, he said. He's done his homework. He always does, she said. Rowan folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. I'm going to town, he said. To do what? Talk to some people. He put on his hat. Stay here. Keep Elias close. She wanted to argue that she was not someone who needed to be kept, but she recognized the practicality of it and the fact that this wasn't the moment to make that particular point. Who are you going to talk to? She asked instead. He paused at the door. I've got some old alliances in this county, he said. Men who know me and know how I operate. Men who also know what Vane's kind looks like, because they've seen it before. He looked at her. I'm not doing this without you knowing what I'm doing. I want you to understand that. She understood it. She felt the weight of it. Not as rescue, which she had learned to resist on principle, but as something more honest. Partnership, maybe. The real kind, where both people know the problem and both people work the problem. All right, she said. He went. She stayed. That first day was the hardest. Not because anything happened, nothing happened, but because waiting for something you know is coming is a particular kind of labor. She worked through it the way she worked through everything. She did what was in front of her. She repaired a saddle girth that had been needing attention for a week. She updated the ledger. She sat with Elias in the afternoon and went through his arithmetic, though neither of them was fully focused on it. And at one point he put his pencil down and looked at her with those old eyes in his young face. Are you scared? He asked. Yes, she said, because she'd decided when he came to the ranch that she would not lie to him about things that mattered. He nodded slowly. Me too. He picked up his pencil again. Is it better to be scared and stay, or not scared and run? She thought about this seriously, the way the question deserved. Staying doesn't make you braver, she said. Sometimes running is the right thing. The question isn't scared or not scared. It's whether what you're staying for is worth the cost of staying for it. He thought about that. Is this worth it? She looked around the kitchen, at the ledger and the dried herbs and Elias's primer on the bench, at the chair where Rowan sat every morning with his coffee, and the lamp that burned in the window on the night she came back late. Yes, she said, this is worth it. Rowan came back in the late afternoon of the second day, and he was not alone. He brought with him a man named Cal Pruitt, who was the county deputy and who Rowan had known, apparently, for 15 years, and a rancher from the next valley named Hector Brandt, who was large and quiet and looked at Evelyn with straightforward assessment when he was introduced and then seemed to come to a decision and stick to it. They sat at the kitchen table and talked through what Garrick Vane was and what he was doing and what the options were. It was a practical, unsentimental conversation, and Evelyn was part of it, which was not something she'd always been able to take for granted. Cal Pruitt had heard of Vane. Not from the Wyoming side, from Colorado, where a similar situation had played out 4 years ago. He picks people who can't afford to be seen, Pruitt said, his elbows on the table, his hat in his hands. Women, mostly. People who've got history they're carrying. He's very good at finding the exact shape of what they're afraid of. Can you move him on? Rowan asked. On what grounds? Pruitt said. Technically, he's done nothing I can name. Sent a letter, came calling. He's very careful about what he puts in writing. He looked at Evelyn. The situation you've described, what happened with Rourke, I want to be clear with you that as far as I'm concerned, that's not a crime. Not in any jurisdiction where the law is working the way it's supposed to. He paused. I know the law doesn't always work that way, but I want you to know where I stand. I appreciate that, she said, and meant it. What he's going to do, Pruitt said, is push until he gets something. Either you pay him or you don't, and if you don't, he escalates. In Colorado, escalating meant property damage, threats that weren't in writing, physical intimidation. He looked at Rowan. He had hired men in Colorado. He's got 2 with him here. 3 possibly, Evelyn said. The boy counted at least 3 horses. Pruitt nodded. Then he's planning for resistance. He's done this before and he knows how it goes when people push back. He was quiet for a moment. This is going to get harder before it gets easier. I want you both to know that. I know that, Evelyn said. So do I, said Rowan. Hector Brandt, who had been quiet through all of this, said, What do you need? It was a simple question, and it was the right one. Rowan looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. And in the look that passed between them was something that had been building for months. Through the winter mornings and the calving nights and the arguments and the small necessary honesty of living close to someone. And it was not neat, and it was not simple, and she couldn't have named all the things it contained, but the clearest thing in it was this. They were not doing this alone. Neither of them. We need to know who's with us, Rowan said, still looking at Evelyn when he said it. And who isn't? When it comes to it. I'm with you, Pruitt said, for what the law can do. I'm with you, Hector Brandt said, for what it can't. Evelyn looked at the 4 men at her kitchen table, men who had no obligation to her, who owed her nothing, who were here anyway. And she felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not relief, because it wasn't over. Not gratitude, because it was bigger than that and more complicated. Something that had to do with what it felt like when, after years of doing everything alone because there was no other way, there was another way. She looked at Rowan. We're not giving him anything, she said. No, he said. We're not. Outside, the aspens had shed half their leaves in the 2 days since Vane had come up the road, and the October light was going thin and cold, and the first serious frost of the season was coming. Evelyn could feel it in the air when she opened the back door that evening. That edge, that particular sharpness that meant winter was assembling itself in the north and would arrive when it was ready, whether anyone was ready for it or not. She stood on the back porch and looked at the pasture and the ridge above it, at the aspens pale against the evening sky, at the cattle moving slowly in the cold, at this particular piece of the world that had been, against all her planning and all her expectations, the place she'd ended up. She heard the door behind her, and she didn't need to look to know who it was. Rowan stood beside her, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, We'll need to talk about the rifle, whether you know how to use one. I know how, she said. Ike showed me in February. He told me, Rowan said. She could hear something in his voice that was close to what she was feeling. Not comfortable, not easy, but resolved. The particular tone of people who have made a decision they're not happy about and are going to live with it anyway. Rowan, she said. Yeah. Whatever happens, I need you to know I didn't mean for this to land here. On your place. On Elias. On Evelyn. He said her name the way he said the important things. Quietly and without anything extra on it. Stop apologizing for existing. She was quiet for a moment. Above the ridge, the first stars were beginning to come up, cold and clear. All right, she said. She can't. They stood on the porch a little longer, not talking, while the dark came down and the cold settled in, and the ranch was quiet around them, with the particular quiet of something gathering itself. And somewhere down the road in the dark, a man named Garrick Vane was also preparing for what came next. The second letter from Garrick Vane arrived on a Friday, and it was shorter than the first. It said, My patience has limits. I expect an answer by Sunday evening. After that, I cannot be responsible for what my associates may find necessary. Rowan read it standing at the kitchen table. He set it down. He picked it up again and read it a second time, which was not something he normally did. He was a first reading kind of man, deliberate and final. The second reading told her the letter had unsettled him in a way the first had not. He's moving the timeline, she said. He's got a reason to move the timeline, Rowan said, which means something changed. He looked at her. Cal Pruitt paid him a visit yesterday to make clear that this county has eyes on him. And Vane took that as a signal to speed up rather than back down. That's what it looks like. She'd expected something like this. Men like Garrick Vane didn't back down when they encountered resistance. They recalibrated. They moved faster. They found a different angle. The warning from Pruitt had not frightened him off. It had simply communicated that the window for a quiet resolution was closing, and so he was adjusting accordingly. "What do we have until Sunday?" she asked. 2 days. Then we use them. What followed was the most deliberately practical 48 hours of Evelyn's life, which was saying something, because her life had contained a fair number of practical necessities. She and Rowan went through the ranch's defensible positions, not as a military exercise because neither of them was a soldier, but as a working problem. Where were the approaches? Where was cover? Where were the weak points? The outbuilding to the east that had never been repaired was a liability. It had a clear line of sight to the main house from the road. They could not fix that in 2 days, but they could be aware of it. Ike, who had served in the war 20-something years ago in a capacity he never specified, looked at the yard with the eyes of someone who'd once been required to think in these terms and remembered more of it than he perhaps wanted to. He walked the perimeter of the yard on the first morning and came back with 3 observations he delivered in his usual economy of words. The feed barn door needed a bar on the inside. The water trough gave cover from the east approach but not the north. And if anyone came in from the tree line at the back, they'd have 30 yards of open yard before they reached the house. "The tree line," Rowan said. "That's where I'd come from," Ike said, "if I was coming." They put a bar on the feed barn door. They moved the good horses from the near paddock into the barn. Elias, who had been doing everything asked of him without complaint, helped shift hay and equipment with a focused efficiency that made Evelyn's chest ache in a way she couldn't fully explain. Something about watching a 12-year-old prepare for violence with such practical calm. He should have been doing arithmetic at a school desk. He was stacking feed sacks against a wall to create cover near the barn entrance. She found him doing it on the second afternoon and stood in the barn doorway watching him for a moment. "You don't have to do that," she said. He looked at her. "I know. You could go to town, stay with Dottie until this is settled." He considered this, not dismissively. He actually thought about it, which was one of the things she'd always found striking about him. He didn't treat choices as performances. "No," he said, finally. Because this is where I live," he said. Simple and complete. She didn't argue with that. She helped him finish stacking the feed sacks and they went in together for supper. Saturday evening, Hector Brandt arrived with 2 men from his ranch, brothers named Cord and Pete Alvarado, who were quiet and capable-looking and greeted Evelyn with a directness that she found she was grateful for. No performance of courtesy, no assessment of whether she'd earned their presence. They were there because Hector had asked them to be, and that was sufficient for all parties. Thus, Cal Pruitt came an hour after dark. He had his deputy's authority and his personal revolver and the specific weariness of a lawman who had long ago stopped believing that his authority was always sufficient for what the world required of him. They sat around the kitchen table, all of them, including Elias, who had simply sat down and not been asked to leave, and whom nobody asked to leave, and they talked through what Sunday might bring. "He's got at minimum 3 men, Pruitt said, "possibly 4. One of them I've identified as a man named Decker who has history in Nevada that I don't love. The other 2 I can't place." "Decker," Rowan said. "You know him?" "By reputation." Rowan's jaw was tight. "He's not just hired security. He's hired for situations that go past security." The table was quiet for a moment. "Then we're not talking about intimidation," Evelyn said. Not a question. "We might be," Pruitt said carefully. "Vane may still be hoping you'll fold before it comes to anything physical. These men are insurance." "Or they're the plan," Rowan said. "Or they're the plan," Pruitt agreed. Evelyn looked at the table. She thought about the first letter, with its careful language and its reasonable-sounding proposition. She thought about the second letter, with its quietly absolute threat. She thought about Garrick Vane on his horse at the edge of the yard, doing his inventory of what was here and what it might cost. "He won't leave until he gets something," she said. "You should all know that. I've dealt with him before. He doesn't walk away from leverage without extracting value from it. If we hold tonight and nothing happens, he'll come back. Different time, different approach, but he'll come back." She paused. "The only way this ends is if he's given a reason to believe there's nothing to extract." "And what reason would that be?" Cord Alvarado asked. He was the older of the two brothers, with a straightforward face and the habit of asking questions directly when he had them. If the information he's carrying becomes worthless, Evelyn said, if the things he's threatening to reveal are already known, or if the people he'd reveal them to have already heard them and decided it doesn't change anything. She looked at Rowan. Cal Pruitt knows the situation. Hector knows the situation. You know the situation. She glanced at Elias, who was looking at the table. Elias knows. Dottie Marsh has known pieces of it for months. Vane's leverage depends on my being afraid of what happens if people find out who I am and what I've done. But if the people in this room, if the people who matter, already know and are still here, she stopped. Then what is he selling? And to whom? The kitchen was quiet. Ike, who had been sitting at the far end of the table and had not said a word for the past hour, said, She's right. Everyone looked at him. He's selling shame, Ike said. That's the whole business. You take the shame away, he's got nothing. He looked at Evelyn steadily. Way I see it, you've already taken it away. In this room, anyway. She held his gaze. Ike was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and he was not a man who offered comfort as a substitute for truth, and she knew that about him. What he was saying was not consolation, it was his actual assessment. In this room, she said. Yes. Then we protect this room, Ike said, and picked up his coffee. Sunday arrived gray and cold, with a sky the color of old iron and a wind from the north that carried the smell of snow still some distance away. It was the kind of day that felt like preparation, as though the weather itself understood that something was coming and was setting the stage accordingly. They positioned themselves before noon, Pruitt in the barn with sightlines to the road, Cord and Pete Alvarado covering the eastern approach and the tree line at the back respectively. Ike in the house, upstairs window, which gave him elevation. Rowan in the yard, visible, deliberate, because a yard with nobody in it tells approaching men that the people inside are hiding, and hiding told men like Vane's that you were afraid, and afraid was an invitation. Evelyn was also in the yard. Rowan had not argued about this, which she'd half expected. He'd looked at her when she came out and took up a position near the water trough, and he'd said nothing, which was his version of acknowledgement that she had the right to be where she chose to be on the day that was about her life. She had her mother's folding knife in her coat pocket. She had the rifle Ike had taught her on in February, held across her body at a low angle that was careful rather than aggressive. Her hands were cold. Her breathing was steady. Elias was in the house. That had been the one thing she'd required. Not asked, required. He'd argued briefly, with the particular stubbornness of a boy who understood that being sent inside was its own kind of exclusion. She'd looked at him and said, I need to know you're safe so I can think clearly. If you're in the yard, I can't think clearly. Do you understand the difference? He'd understood the difference. He'd gone inside. Vane's men came at 2 p.m. There were 4 of them, as Pruitt had suspected. They came up the wagon road in a loose group, not the careful single file of the first visit. They were not performing patience this time. Vane rode at the front, still with that broad, almost pleasant face, still in the good coat. Beside him was a man who matched Pruitt's description of Decker, lean, with a stillness about him that was not calm but contained, the specific stillness of someone who had learned to carry violence without showing it until it was needed. They pulled up at the edge of the yard. Rowan stood in the middle of it, 20 feet from the trough where Evelyn was positioned. She watched Vane scan the yard, reading the positions, reading the barn, reading Evelyn with the rifle, reading the implication of all of it. Whatever he'd expected, it was not this. Mr. Hale, he said, and his voice was the same as it had been, measured, almost friendly. But she could hear what was underneath it now, the way you can hear the hollow in a wall when you knock on it. I'd hoped we could resolve this without all of this. You brought 4 men to a private ranch, Rowan said. What did you think you'd find? I brought colleagues, Vane said. Decker's a colleague, Rowan said. All right. The name landing like that, precise and undecorated, did something to the temperature of the exchange. Vane's pleasant expression held, but she watched his hands, and his hands adjusted their grip on the reins. I have a simple proposition, Vane said, addressing Evelyn now, which was his way of trying to remove Rowan from the negotiation. You know what I carry. You know what I can do with it. One payment, one time, and I leave Wyoming and I don't come back. You said that in Ohio, Evelyn said. 7 years ago. First payment. A pause. Circumstances change. What changed was you found me again, she said. The terms didn't change because you had a different intention. They changed because one payment was never what you wanted. One payment was a down payment. She kept her voice level. I'm done making payments. That's an unfortunate decision, Vane said. Cal, Rowan said without raising his voice. Pruitt stepped out of the barn into the yard. He had his badge visible in his hand near his hip, and the particular posture of a man who has seen a great many situations and is not impressed by this one. Garrick Vane, Pruitt said, I'm going to need you to think very carefully about the next thing you do. Decker moved. It was fast and it was trained, and it was the movement of someone who had been waiting for a signal. But Cord Alvarado had been watching Decker specifically from the eastern corner of the barn, and he was already moving when Decker moved, and what followed was not the clean, decisive confrontation of stories, but the chaotic, ugly, terrifying reality of several things happening at once. A shot from somewhere, she never knew whose, and the sound of it was enormous in the cold air. Rowan went left, toward cover. Evelyn brought the rifle up the way Ike had taught her, not fast, but correct, finding the position and holding it, because Ike had told her the second winter that panic shoots fast and misses, and that her job was not to be fast, but to be right. Decker's horse spooked at the shot, and he was managing that for 3 crucial seconds. One of the other hired men had his gun out, but was looking at Cord Alvarado, who was larger than expected, and it appeared from an angle the man hadn't anticipated. Pruitt had his revolver on Vane directly. Down, Pruitt said to Vane. Off the horse, now. Vane looked at the yard, at Pruitt, at Cord, at Evelyn with the rifle, at Pete Alvarado visible now at the back corner of the house, at Ike's position in the upper window. He was doing math, the kind of rapid, unpleasant math that happens when a plan encounters a reality that doesn't match its assumptions. He came down off the horse. It was not over then, not cleanly. One of the hired men, the one Pruitt couldn't identify, made a run for the tree line and Pete went after him, and there was a scramble in the mud at the edge of the yard that lasted too long and ended with Pete sitting on the man's back in the frozen grass and looking considerably less than pleased about it. Decker, once he had his horse managed, did something that surprised everyone, including probably himself. He looked at the composition of the yard, looked at Vane dismounted and being held at gunpoint by a deputy, and made a precise professional calculation and holstered his weapon. I'm hired for situations that have a reasonable outcome, Decker said, to no one in particular. This isn't one. It was possibly the most sensible thing said by anyone that afternoon. The fourth man followed Decker's lead without needing to be told. Pruitt had Vane's wrists in irons within the minute, and Evelyn lowered the rifle and discovered that her hands were shaking. Not badly, not enough to have mattered while she was holding it, but noticeably now. She let them shake. That seemed reasonable. She set the rifle against the trough and let them shake for a moment, and then they stopped. Rowan appeared beside her. He didn't say anything. He looked at her hands and then at her face. I'm all right, she said. I know, he said. My hands... Everybody's hands do that after, he said. It's just the body catching up. She nodded, took a breath, looked at the yard, at Pruitt managing Vane toward the road, at Cord and Pete with the 2 surrendered men, at Ike coming down from the house, moving stiffly in the cold because his hip was always worse after he'd been stationary. Garrick Vane looked at her as Pruitt moved him past. The pleasant expression was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was not rage. She'd expected rage, but something uglier and smaller. The look of a man who has discovered that the thing he was selling has no buyer, and who understands finally what that means. This isn't finished, he said. It is, she said, quietly, without drama. You've got nothing left to sell. Everyone here knows everything, and they're still here. He looked at Rowan. She's right, Rowan said. Pruitt moved Vane down the road. The yard was quiet. Ike came and stood beside them and looked at the road where the riders had gone and said, Gonna need to put the horses back in the paddock. They've been in the barn since yesterday, and they're unhappy about it. I'll do it, Elias said. Evelyn turned. Elias was in the yard. He had very clearly not stayed in the house for the latter portion of the afternoon. She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that was prepared for consequences and had decided they were worth it. "Elias Webb," she said. "I stayed by the window until the shooting," he said. "After that, I was in the doorway. I didn't come into the yard." "The doorway is not the house." "No, ma'am." She held his gaze for a moment. He held hers back. There was something in his face, not defiance, not exactly, but the refusal of a boy who has decided that the people in this yard are his people, and he is not going to be inside a wall while his people are in danger, regardless of what he's been told. She thought about 16-year-old Evelyn Mercer with her mother's folding knife and her absolute refusal to stay in a situation that would kill her. She thought about the long series of choices that had brought her here, to this yard, on this day. She looked at the boy. "Go put the horses back," she said. He went. The evening was strange in the way evenings are after extreme things, too ordinary almost after the scale of the afternoon. Pruitt would hold Vane in the Black Hollow jail on charges of threatening with intent, extortion, and carrying weapons without cause on private property, which between them constituted enough to keep him occupied for a considerable stretch of time. Decker and his remaining colleague had agreed to leave the county voluntarily, which Court Alvarado found professionally insufficient but practically acceptable. Hector Brandt and his men stayed for supper. Dottie Marsh arrived at some point in the early evening, having heard from someone in town that something had happened at Hale Ridge, and she walked in the front door without knocking, looked at the assembled company, and said, "Is everyone in one piece?" And when told yes, she took off her coat and helped with supper, which was the most Dottie way possible of saying what she meant. The kitchen table that night held 8 people and was not designed for 8 people and was managed by the simple expedient of not caring about that. There was beef stew that Evelyn had put on the day before in a gesture of either optimism or superstition, and cornbread, and Hector Brandt produced a bottle of whiskey from inside his coat with the air of a man who had learned from experience to carry one when invited to uncertain situations. Elias ate 2 full bowls of stew and then fell asleep sitting up at the table with his chin approaching his chest, and nobody remarked on it until Rowan stood up and moved the boy's bowl out of range and said to Ike, "Can you—" "I've got him," Ike said, and maneuvered Elias to bed in the way of a man who'd had some experience with sleeping children, which surprised everyone, including probably Ike. The table got quieter as the evening went on and people left or moved to the sitting room, and eventually it was just Evelyn and Rowan and the lamp and the last of the stew going cold in the pot on the stove. "It's not finished," Evelyn said. Not repeating Vane, she'd meant what she'd said to him, but acknowledging a different thing. "Even with Vane in jail and Decker gone, the rest of it, what I told you, what I've done, it doesn't disappear." "No," Rowan said, "it doesn't. There will be other people who look at me and see—" "There have always been people like that," he said. "Before today, even. That's not new." She looked at him across the table. "What's different," he said, "is that today you didn't run." She sat with that for a moment. She turned it over and looked at its underside, checking for the hollow place where the truth should be. She couldn't find one. "No," she said. "I didn't." He reached across the table. Not dramatically. Just set his hand on the table near hers, palm up. The way you offer something without demanding it be taken. She looked at his hand for a moment, at the white scar along his knuckles from a February night with a broken fence, at the roughness of it, the imperfection of it, the absolute honesty of a hand that had spent 20 years working. She put her hand in his. Neither of them said anything. The lamp burned. The stove settled. Outside, the Wyoming night had gone completely dark, and somewhere up on the ridge, the first snow of the season was probably starting, and the ranch was quiet around them in the way it got quiet when everyone in it was finally, for this moment, all right. It was not a perfect moment. It had too much history in it to be perfect, and they were both too aware of that history for the kind of simple happiness that doesn't know what it cost. But it was real. It was solidly, unambiguously real in a way that very few things in Evelyn's life had been, and she held on to it with the same grip she'd used on the rifle that afternoon. Not white-knuckled, not desperate, but deliberate. Certain. After a while, Rowan said, "The east fence on the south pasture is going to need work before the snow gets serious." "I know," she said. "I put it in the ledger. We could do it tomorrow if the weather holds." "It'll hold until Wednesday," she said. Ike said Thursday at earliest for the snow. Then Wednesday. Wednesday, she agreed. His thumb moved slightly against the back of her hand. She didn't remark on it. She let it be what it was. The lamp burned. The night held. The ranch breathed around them, steady and imperfect in theirs, and outside the aspens on the ridge stood bare against the dark sky, and the stars were very clear, and the snow was still a few days away. They sat together until the lamp needed oil, and then they refilled it and sat a while longer. The snow that Ike had predicted for Thursday arrived on Wednesday afternoon instead, which was the kind of small inaccuracy that Ike took personally. He stood on the porch and looked at the sky with an expression of genuine offense. Thursday, he said, to no one in particular. Wednesday, Evelyn said from inside the doorway, and handed him his heavier coat. He took it without comment and went to check the animals, because Ike's response to being wrong about anything was to immediately find something useful to do, which was, she'd decided long ago, probably the healthiest response to being wrong about anything. The snow changed the quality of the weeks that followed, not the content of them, but the texture. There was something about the first real snowfall of winter that pressed everything closer together, the way cold does to people who share walls. The ranch had a different weight to it now. Not heavier, different, more settled, like a house that has finished shifting on its foundation and decided where it stands. Garrick Vane was held in the Black Hollow jail through November, while Cal Pruitt built his case with the methodical patience of a man who understood that a case built too fast was a case that collapsed under examination. Pruitt came out to the ranch twice during that time, not about Vane specifically, but to let them know where things stood and to drink coffee at their kitchen table in the way of a man maintaining an alliance he found worthwhile. On his second visit, near the end of November, he told them he'd made inquiries about Caleb Rourke's death in Ohio through official channels. Evelyn went still when he said it. Not afraid. That particular fear had been losing its power for a while now, but attentive in the way she got when something important was being said. The official record shows Rourke died of injuries sustained in an altercation with an unknown party, Pruitt said, his hands around his coffee cup. There was an investigation at the time. It went nowhere. He had enemies enough that nobody looked very hard. He paused. Nobody's looking now. She held his gaze. I appreciate you telling me that. I'm telling you because you should know the actual shape of what you've been carrying, he said. Not what Vane told you it was. He put his coffee down. A man who does what Rourke did, to a 17-year-old girl with nowhere to go. That's not the kind of death that keeps lawmen up at night, even the ones who found the body. She didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the snow was coming down in the particular steady way of snow that intends to stay. 7 years, she said finally. Not a complaint, just naming the weight of it. Yeah, Pruitt said. Rowan, sitting at the other end of the table, said nothing, but his hand, resting on the table, moved a half-inch toward her and stopped there. She noticed. She didn't look at it. She noticed. Pruitt left that afternoon with the case against Vane consolidated enough that he was confident about what came next. Extradition proceedings back to Colorado, where the events 4 years ago had left enough of a paper trail that Wyoming's case could be joined to a larger one. Vane would not be returning to Black Hollow. His 2 remaining hired men had been located as far as Cheyenne and had shown no interest in revisiting their employer's situation in Wyoming, which was, Pruitt said, the most sensible decision either of them had made in recent memory. It was finally over. Not the snow, not the work, not the 1,000 ordinary difficulties of running a cattle ranch in Wyoming in the winter with inadequate fencing in the south pasture and a hand with a bad hip and a boy who was growing too fast for his clothes. Those things continued because they were the actual texture of a life, and a life doesn't resolve itself into stillness simply because the dramatic part is finished. But the particular weight she'd been carrying, the years of running, the payments, the burned letters and changed names, and the cold, specific fear of being found, that weight was different now, not gone. She didn't think it would ever be entirely gone. Things that live in you for 7 years don't vacate like a tenant who's been given notice. But it had changed in character, from a weight that pressed down to a weight that was simply part of her architecture, something she'd built herself around without entirely meaning to, and that was now, she was starting to understand, part of what held her up. Dottie Marsh said something about this, in her way, when Evelyn came into the shop in early December. Dottie had heard the whole story by then. Evelyn had told her herself, sitting at the workbench with her hands in her lap, because Dottie deserved the actual truth after months of receiving careful portions of it, and because Evelyn had decided that she was done managing what people knew about her based on what they might do with it. Dottie had listened without interrupting, which was not her natural inclination. When Evelyn finished, Dottie sat for a moment, and then she said, "You know what I notice?" "What?" "You told me that whole thing without apologizing once." Evelyn thought about it. "No," she said slowly. "I suppose I didn't." "6 months ago you would have," Dottie said. "You would have apologized for existing before you got to the end of it." She picked up her scissors. "Something changed in you, Evelyn." "A few things changed," Evelyn said. "Most of them have the same last name," Dottie said, without looking up from the cloth she was cutting. And Evelyn found that she didn't have a response to that, so she said nothing, and Dottie's mouth did what it did when she was trying not to smile. The marriage happened in March when the snow was going and the ground was soft and the aspens on the ridge were starting to show the first small green that meant they'd made it through another winter. It was not a large event. Pruitt stood witness. Hector Brandt and Cord Alvarado came because they'd been there for the hard part, and it seemed right that they should be there for this. Dottie came and cried efficiently and without embarrassment, the way Dottie did everything. Ike wore a clean shirt, which represented for Ike a significant formal commitment. Elias stood beside Rowan. Nobody had asked him to. He'd simply positioned himself there in the way he had of deciding where he belonged and then being there. And when Evelyn looked at him in his too short sleeves and his serious face, he gave her a nod that was meant to be encouraging and managed to be, which made her eyes do things she'd have preferred they didn't do in front of an audience. It was not a smooth ceremony. The man who performed it was a justice of the peace from the next county who had a cold and got the words slightly wrong in 2 places and didn't seem entirely certain he was remembering everything in the right order. It was cold enough that everyone's breath made small clouds. Rowan forgot, briefly, what he was supposed to do with his hands and settled on holding them at his sides in the stance of a man waiting for a wagon, which made Cord Alvarado have a coughing fit that had nothing to do with illness. It was, in other words, completely real, and completely theirs. Afterward, at the kitchen table that had held so many conversations over the past year, Evelyn sat across from her husband. The word was strange and solid in her mind, like a piece of furniture you keep expecting to run into and are surprised each time to find it exactly where it should be, and listened to Dottie and Hector arguing about the proper ratio of whiskey to hot water in a toddy, and watched Ike and Pruitt play a game of cards with the focused silence of 2 men who took cards seriously, and felt Elias's knee against hers under the table where he'd wedged himself into the bench beside her. "You all right?" Elias asked, under the noise. "Yes," she said. "You?" He considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "I think so," he said. "It still feels like it might go wrong." "Most good things feel like that," she said, "for a while." "Does it stop?" She thought about it honestly. "It gets quieter," she said. "The feeling doesn't go away entirely, but you get better at knowing it's just the feeling and not the fact." He absorbed this. Then, "Is that what happened to you?" She looked at him. This boy, who had arrived on their porch with a too small coat and a canvas sack and a set of watchful eyes that had seen enough hard things to make a grown person careful, and who was now sitting at this table in this kitchen on this particular night as though he'd always been here. "Still working on it," she said. He nodded. That seemed to satisfy him, in the way the honest answer usually satisfied Elias when the reassuring answer would not have. Spring brought calving again, and the work of it, and the losses of it. 2 calves in a single week in April, and one that came out undersized and uncertain and required 3 days of Elias's determined attention before it decided to commit to living, which it eventually did with the stubborn, grudging quality of something that isn't sure it's made the right decision. Elias named it after some private logic Evelyn didn't fully understand and Rowan didn't ask about, which was the correct response, and the calf grew into a yearling that was, objectively, not the most impressive animal on the property, but was alive, which was the point. That summer, Evelyn and Rowan sat down with Elias and talked to him about the future in the specific way that required all 3 of them to be honest about things they'd been carrying in careful silence. It was not an easy conversation. Rowan, who was not a man who expressed things with ease, struggled his way through the part about what they wanted, and Elias listened with his hands flat on the table and his face doing several things at once, And when Rowan finished, Elias was quiet for long enough that Evelyn's chest tightened. Then Elias said, "You're asking if I want to stay, permanently." "We're asking," Evelyn said, "if you want this to be your home, not just the place you work, your home." Another pause. "What would that make you, Bap?" he asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking, working out the shape of it. "Whatever you want it to make us," Rowan said, which was, for Rowan, a remarkable degree of open-handedness. "We're not trying to replace anything you had. We're offering something different." Elias looked at the table. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at Rowan. "All right," he said. It was for Elias a full sentence. They filed the paperwork with the county in September, and it was processed with the particular slowness of bureaucratic machinery everywhere. And Ike served as witness on the day it was finalized with the same clean shirt he'd worn to the wedding, which Evelyn suspected was his only dress shirt and which she appreciated in a way she didn't express directly because Ike would have found that embarrassing. Life at Hale Ridge settled into the shape that would define the years that followed. Not comfortable in the way of ease, because it was never easy exactly, but comfortable in the way of known. The work was hard and seasonal and occasionally punishing, and the winters were serious, and the cattle had opinions about everything, and the fences always needed work, and Ike's hip got worse with every year, and Elias grew 4 inches between 15 and 16 and ate everything in the kitchen with democratic enthusiasm. There were hard years. The drought summer when the creek ran low and they lost 12 head, and the strain of it put a distance between Evelyn and Rowan that took most of the fall to close. The winter when Elias at 17 made a decision about a fence repair in a coming storm that was wrong and resulted in 3 hours of genuine danger before Rowan got to him, and the conversation afterward was not gentle and was necessary, and left marks on both of them that didn't entirely fade. The year the south pasture flooded in May, and they lost the planting they'd planned for the kitchen garden, and Evelyn cried about it, which surprised her. She hadn't expected to cry about a kitchen garden, but she had worked it with her own hands for 3 years, and there was something in watching it go underwater that hit somewhere she hadn't anticipated. Rowan found her at the fence looking at the flooded ground, and he stood beside her and looked at it too, and after a moment he said, "We'll replant in June. Different beds further from the creek." "I know," she said. "You're allowed to be upset about it." "I know that too." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "It's just a garden." "It's your garden," he said. "That's not the same thing." She looked at him. He was watching the flooded pasture with the steady expression of a man who had lost a great deal in his life and had learned to hold it without being crushed by it, and who was now, she thought, trying to show her something about how that was done. "How do you do it?" she asked. "Keep losing things and staying put." He thought about it, the way he thought about the things she asked him directly, without rushing to an answer that sounded good, but finding the actual one. "I stopped counting the losing separately from the having," he said finally. "It's the same account. You don't get to have something without putting it in the column where it can be lost." He paused. "Seems better to have it anyway." She stood with that for a while. The flooded ground caught the afternoon light and threw it back in flat silver sheets, and above the ridge the sky was the particular washed blue of after a storm. And behind her the ranch was there, solid and imperfect, and occupied by people she loved in a way that still sometimes surprised her with its specificity. Not abstract love, not gratitude dressed as love, but the actual detailed knowledge of particular people. Elias arguing with himself over mathematics at the kitchen table. Ike's commentary on the weather, always slightly wrong, always delivered with complete conviction. Rowan at 4:30 in the morning with his coffee, in the particular stillness that was his and nobody else's. She'd built this. Not alone. Nothing real gets built alone. And she knew that now in her bones in a way she hadn't always known it. But she'd built it. With her hands and her stubbornness and her mother's folding knife and $41 and a burned letter and the willingness to stay in a place and a life that kept asking more of her than she'd planned to give. She replanted the garden in June. The years moved in this way of years that are full. Not fast, not slow, but layered, each one leaving something on top of the last, the way good soil builds. Elias grew into a man who was both easier and harder to know than the boy had been. Easier because he'd come to trust his place in the world enough to say what he thought. Harder because what he thought was often complicated and he no longer packaged it for ease of receipt. He took over the management of the cattle operations by the time he was 22 with the methodical competence that had always been in him. And he did it the way Evelyn had done it years before, not making a ceremony of the transition, just picking up the weight and carrying it. He did not marry young. He did not for a long time seem particularly interested in it, and Evelyn did not push because she understood, better than most, that a person who'd spent their formative years learning to trust people slowly was not going to stop doing that just because they'd grown up, and the people were now of a romantic variety. He found someone eventually, a woman from the next county named Ruth, who had a directness that made Evelyn like her immediately, and a stubbornness that made Rowan say, "They'll be fine," in the tone of a man who recognized the condition. Ike died in the winter of the year Elias turned 24. He died in the smaller room of the house where he'd moved when his hip made the stairs difficult. And he died in the early morning the way he'd lived. Quietly, with a minimum of fuss, in the company of a ranch that had been his for 30 years. Evelyn was with him in the last hours, sitting in the chair by his bed, and they didn't talk much because Ike had never seen the need to fill silence with sound. And she'd learned that from him, actually. That lesson had come from Ike, the value of being present without performing presence. At some point near the end, he opened his eyes and looked at her and said, "You turned out all right." "You helped with that," she said. "Some," he said, which was, for Ike, a large admission. They buried him on the ridge above the ranch where he'd asked to be buried, in the ground he'd worked for 30 years. The aspens were bare. The sky was that iron color that Wyoming sky turns in winter, and the cold was serious, and Elias read something he'd written himself because he'd asked to, and it was right that he should. Ruth stood beside him. Rowan stood beside Evelyn, and his hand found hers and held it, and she held it back. She thought, "We keep losing things and staying put." And she thought, yes, that's the deal. That's always been the deal. The years after Ike were quieter, but not empty. The ranch continued under Elias's management and Evelyn's ledgers, which she kept until her eyes gave her trouble at 60, and then she passed them to Ruth, who had turned out to have a facility for numbers that nobody had initially guessed. Rowan aged the way hard-working men age, unevenly, stubbornly, with periods of apparent immunity and then sudden surrenders to the accumulation. His left knee gave out the winter he was 63, and the doctor in Black Hollow, who was now the third doctor to serve the town since Evelyn arrived, told him plainly that the work of his 20s had sent a bill to his 60s, which Rowan received with the resigned acknowledgement of a man who knew this was fair. He kept working, slower and more selectively, but he kept working, because Rowan Hale was not built for the alternative, and they all knew it. Evelyn watched him the way she'd learned to watch everything that mattered, not anxiously, not controlling, but attentively, knowing what she was looking at, knowing its worth. He died in February, on a morning when the snow had been falling for 2 days and the ranch was buried in white and very quiet, in the bed in the room they'd shared for more than 20 years. He died the way Ike had died, early, without drama, with a sense of completion that was different from simply stopping. Evelyn was beside him. She had been beside him all night because she'd known, the way you know things about people you have inhabited a life with, that the night mattered. She held his hand when he went. She sat for a while after, in the quiet of the room, with the snow coming down outside the window and the ranch still around her. She thought about the morning she'd found him in the ditch with the horse and the bad leg, and how she'd stood in the cold deciding whether to stop. She thought about the kitchen table and the coffee and all the mornings of not speaking that had turned into something more valuable than most of the conversations she'd had in her life. She thought about what he'd said about the flooded garden. You don't get to have something without putting it in the column where it can be lost. And she thought that he had been, in his way, always trying to tell her the thing he most believed, that the losing and the having were the same account, that the answer was to have anyway. She'd believed him. She still did. Elias came up when she didn't come down, and he found her sitting there, and he didn't say anything for a moment, and then he came and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, which was not something she'd have done when he was 12 or 15 or even 20. But he was 30 now, and he was solid, and he was hers. He was a good man, Elias said. He was a hard man, she said, and a good one. It wasn't always easy to know where one stopped and the other started. You figured it out. Eventually, he put his arm around her. They sat together while the snow came down. She stayed at Hale Ridge through that winter and the spring, and through one more summer because there were things to settle and she was not a woman who left things unsettled. She and Elias went through the ranch accounts together, which were solid. Rowan had left things in order because he'd always left things in order. It was one of the steadiest things about him. And the property transferred without difficulty. Ruth made tea and sat with Evelyn in the evenings, and they talked about practical things, which was what Evelyn needed, and Ruth was perceptive enough to know it. In the fall, Evelyn packed a bag. Not a carpet bag this time. A proper traveling bag, well made, the kind you buy when you expect to use it for a while. She packed it with the economy of someone who knew exactly what she needed and did not require the comfort of carrying more. Elias found her in the morning, the bag sitting by the front door. He looked at it. He looked at her. His face did something complicated that he managed to hold steady. "South," she said before he could ask. "How far south?" "I don't know yet." She looked at him. "I'm not leaving because I want to be somewhere else. I'm leaving because I've been here long enough to know I can, and that's a different thing." He understood the difference. She knew he would. "You'll write," he said. "I'll write," she said. "And if you need—" "I'll write," she said again gently. "And you'll know." He nodded. He picked up her bag and carried it to where the horse was waiting because he was his father's son in the ways that mattered. Not by blood, which had nothing to do with it, but by the long accumulation of living in the same house and breathing the same air and watching the same man move through the world. He carried the bag, and he helped her up, and he stood back. She looked at the ranch from the height of the saddle, at the house with its 2 stories and its full-length porch, solid despite its years, at the repaired outbuilding that Elias had finally fixed 3 summers ago, straight and tight, at the fence lines running clean across the winter-brown grass, at the ridge above with its aspens bare against the pale sky, the same aspens she'd first seen going gold the October vein had come, and that had stood there through everything that followed, losing their leaves and getting them back and losing them again the way things do when they're rooted. She thought about arriving here, cold, alone, with $41 and no plan, and a bitterness so deep it had felt structural. She thought about the woman she'd been then, standing in the frozen street of Black Hollow, thinking that she would not give this place the satisfaction of her defeat. She hadn't. She thought, what you are is made of what you survive and what you choose, and who you let stand beside you while you're doing both. She thought, I didn't know any of that when I came here. I learned it here. From the cold and the work, and a man who left a lamp on in the window and called it nothing. She thought, I'm going to carry this with me for the rest of my life, and it will weigh nothing, because the things you build with people you love don't weigh anything when you carry them. They just become part of how you move. She turned the horse south. Elias watched her go until she reached the tree line and disappeared into it. He stood there a moment longer in the cold, looking at the empty road. Then he turned back to the ranch. His ranch now, the one his father had built and his mother had kept and that he had grown into. And he went back to work. Because that was what you did. You stayed. You worked. You let the people you loved go when they were ready. You kept the fences. You watched the aspens on the ridge go bare and come back. You learned over time that the losing and the having were the same account. And you had anyway. Behind her, the ranch sat on its ridge in the pale winter light, solid and real, and full of the particular history of people who had chosen each other in hard conditions and meant it. The kind of place that doesn't announce itself. The kind of place you only recognize once you're already inside it, and by then it's too late, and that's exactly right, and that's exactly how it should be. The road south unrolled in front of Evelyn Mercer Hale, long and cold and open, and she rode into it with her back straight and her hands easy on the reins, and the particular freedom of a woman who had nothing to run from and know where she had to be, and who understood, finally and completely, the difference.